All right, good morning and welcome to our latest segment of Deep Dive. We are in the studio with Brenda Golden, and today we're going to be talking about some red alert legislation that is geared toward helping in the missing and murdered Indigenous people epidemic. I want to introduce our guest to you. It's Miss Brenda Golden. She's come in and she is an attorney, and she's Muskogee Creek citizen, and she has been instrumental in helping getting some legislation authored that she hopes will impact this crisis we're seeing all over the country. But for Oklahoma in particular, it is a piece of legislation that we're kind of calling the Red Alert. It's going to set up a system in which people who are Indigenous and who do go missing or are in danger can be helped, and it can create better outcomes for those situations. And Brenda is also an advocate with the Missing, Murdered, and Indigenous Women Indian Capital chapter. And can you tell us a little bit about that organization?
The organization MMIW Indian Capital is headquartered in Anadarko, and about 5 years ago, my friend Sharice Redbone sent me an email and asked me if I could help with some bylaws and setting up a new organization. Little did I know that it was MMIW Indian Capital. And since that time, every year they've had an event at the Capitol. They do marches, they do rallies, and I believe now there are 8 or 9 MMIW chapters, but MMIW Indian Capital was the very first.
Okay, and is that in Oklahoma?
It's in Oklahoma, Anadarko, yes.
Anadarko, Oklahoma. And what is some of the things other than, like, do they advocate? Do they help people with resources in emergency situations?
They do, and they also help search, bring together search parties, and when someone goes missing in their area, they try to reach out to the families and see what assistance they can provide. If it's getting an advocate to go with them to talk to the police, or whether it's actually boots on the ground searching, they kind of cover a wide variety of just whatever is needed to help that family at the time.
So we've brought up their Facebook page. I didn't know if there was a specific website that had any more information, but I have their website page up. And they have different information that people can kind of stay linked in on and see what's going on. Let's kind of talk a little bit about the situation that arises that creates the need for these chapters. And that is that Indigenous people can be in danger or they go missing, and this has become a crisis, and the outcomes are very poor at this time for, getting those people safely back home, or creating, teams that can go looking for them. Can you talk a little bit about some of these statistics that we're seeing coming out of this?
Well, as you may know, a lot of attention has come upon this subject in the last couple of years, but it originally started about 30 years ago in the 70s when women in Canada started, they call it the Trail of Tears. They began going missing on this certain highway in Canada, and it's called the Highway of Tears. And so that was kind of the when people first started becoming aware that this is an issue. But of course, we know that Native American women have a long history of being abused and trafficked all the way back to the first colonies. But
Right.
the missing and murdered Indigenous women efforts and here in Oklahoma and across the United States, I would say in the last 2 or 3 years, based on the statistics that we started seeing coming out of studies from the FBI, from the Department of Justice. And one of the problems is that no one was keeping track by the American Indian or Native American status of, and so the numbers weren't, when you put someone into the database, the national database for missing persons, there's no way of knowing how many of those are Native American or American Indian because they just weren't tracking them.
Can you talk about some of the scenarios and stereotypes that play out in the situation? So someone has, a family member, a friend, sibling has reported their relative as missing. Can you talk a little bit about that scenario that plays out that lends to this being a problem?
Well, the problem here in Oklahoma that we heard at the interim study that was sponsored in November at the state capitol, legislators had members of communities come forward and give testimony about their experience with law enforcement and they're reporting missing people. And over, the theme was that when the family member would go to report their loved one missing, the police or the law enforcement agency didn't take it seriously and said that, they'll be back, they wouldn't take the report, or they didn't search for them. They might actually take the police report, but they didn't do any active efforts to try to locate that missing person. And by the time the family made enough noise or people kept going back to the police department, the trail was cold. And we heard that from several families over and over.
We've seen that scenario play out even right here in this county. Just being a member of the media, we've seen a family come to the media, tagging us on social media, saying, we're looking for a loved one. We believe they're in trouble. And whether it was someone else was involved, taking them, or they were just in a dangerous situation that wasn't going to benefit them health-wise, these were individuals searching for their family member on their own, days after, they had spoke to law enforcement. And then it turns out, like we covered this, case, and I haven't asked for specific permission from the family to reshare a name or anything, but we did see that ended in people discovering, law enforcement discovered, a body rather than recovering a person and bringing them home. That leads us into what I wanted to address first is the red alert legislation. And can you tell us a little bit about that legislation and what your role is with that?
Well, as I said, the families had said that, one, law enforcement agencies weren't taking them serious, and two, the media wasn't responding by putting the faces of their loved ones out into the public. So the red alert will address both of those, and some of you may get an alert on your phone when a child goes missing. That's an amber alert, and they have a silver alert for elderly people that are considered helpless or having dementia and they go missing. So a silver alert is another one. And what happens is they put them on the signs on the public highways. All the law enforcement agencies get a bulletin, and they have a photo. The media is then alerted that someone is missing, and so it patterns the silver alert and the amber alert. And I approached the MMIW chapter before the legislative session, and I said, we really need to get someone to sponsor this bill so that there's an alert system. I found that was one of the biggest needs from that testimony, and I drafted it and sent it to the MMIW Indian Capital Chapter president, and they took it to Representative Daniel Pay in Lawton, and he sponsored it for us. Okay, and then we have a local representative, Logan Phillips, who is partially covers Okmulgee County, Okfuskee, Hughes, who's signed on as a co-sponsor of this legislation. So I'm very pleased by that because of the Muskogee people that live in this area.
So what I've got pulled up on our screen, and for our viewers who might be tuning in and watching, this is coined phrase Red Alert Act. And as you said, it's supposed to set up a system kind of mirrored with the Amber Alert system. And one of the things I think that legislators found when they adopted that system was that early reporting is critical to affecting that outcome for recovering a person in danger.
Yes.
And this legislation, as we've kind of picked through it, sets up the systems in which local law enforcement communicates with, the OSBI, the county, the state agencies, even tribal jurisdiction authorities
Yes.
would be able to communicate across those different platforms and systems and get the word out really early that someone might be in danger and they might, need to take action now. Can you talk about any of the particular segments that you thought were really critical for bridging that gap between the agencies, so to speak, and what that communication, cross-agency communication does for those outcomes of a person in danger?
Well, the more information that gets out about a missing person that has their photo, their vital statistics, the better. And currently, as you mentioned, there are some barriers to communication between tribal and things like the local law enforcement agencies. And this would create that system where it's a mass distribution broadcast of this missing person that's in danger. In fact, one of my friends yesterday posted on Facebook that 2 people were seen being abducted in a parking lot, and some people assisted them in getting away. And I thought that's the kind of information that a red alert would address immediately.
And in this legislation, I'm just going to kind of highlight it on the screen for our viewers. It says shall mean that the statewide red alert for missing Indigenous persons, and it shall include, it talks about the relationship with media outlets, radio stations, TV stations, newspapers, local support organizations. And we're kind of familiar with that system. It already is in place for, as you said, the Amber Alert. And what happens in those scenarios tends to be that, a picture goes out, the height, weight, what they look like, who they were last seen with, if they have the information of a car tag. Everybody can even get those alerts on their phones. And the data reflects that those kind of alerts improve getting that person home. We see that happen a lot. And of course, we also see scenarios where there are bad outcomes, but it does reflect that there's an improvement to recovering and better healthy outcomes for those families, for those people who are in danger. When we look at some of the barriers that have created this epidemic process, can you speak to any of those jurisdictional relationships and what that looks like, how it plays out? Because I kind of have seen, it's been mentioned in the media before, maybe something has happened on tribal land, but then our tribal, light horse don't exactly have
the resources
or even the jurisdiction to go to Oklahoma City and knock on a door in an apartment, that isn't tribal land. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, currently there is a bill introduced called Ida's Law that's named after Ida Beard, who went missing in 2015, that would address some of the jurisdictional problems. And as you may know, when a crime happens on tribal property, whether it's restricted or trust land or even what's owned by our own tribe, like the complex, if something happens on the complex, the tribal jurisdiction prevails.
Which bill is this one? I got the 4 ones listed here.
Ida's Laws, House Bill 33. I don't think you printed it out.
Okay.
It was introduced by Representative Mickey Dolans.
Okay, let me try and find it real quick.
And so it becomes a question of who has the authority to investigate, who has the authority to start the process of searching, who should take the lead if it happens on tribal land, and what's a real problem is that you never know, because there's no map right in front of you with a line showing where the jurisdiction ends and stops. So it causes an issue when you have restricted land next to regular fee land next to trust property. And the Ida's Law would help address that issue, because it would have a missing person specialist at the OSBI to help communicate with all of those parties when someone goes missing.
And I've pulled this up for our audience to look at. It's House Bill 3345. As you said, Mickey Dollins has sponsored the legislation. And it's also the same bill that creates that position in the OSBI to serve as kind of the Indigenous expert on
Yes.
these situations. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think that this is a major step in meeting the federal task force that President Trump has set up. We also have a person assigned from Oklahoma. We have a task force here in Oklahoma. And so this person is critical to as a linchpin to the communication between the tribal officials, local law enforcement, county, state. That person would be tasked with communicating and addressing all of those.
So those jurisdictional problems that kind of rise up, they'd be the one. And I don't know if the audience is really familiar with what I'm pulling up here on the screen. I wanted to take just a brief second to show them that as I'm looking for these laws, and I'm finding them on a really handy website that I've been using, and it is called Legiscan. And you can type in bill numbers or even text, like I've done here in this full text search. And I just typed in Ida's Law real quick, hit search,
and it brought it up.
And it brings it up. If people were wanting to follow along and check out what we're talking about here, that's how we're finding it. It gives the bill summary. It also has some really handy tools and buttons where you can see who sponsored the legislation, and it will show you that information. You can get the text. If it comes to vote, you can see the votes on this legislation. You can look at the research that was used to author this legislation, and you even have a button where you can track legislation, so you can put in your email address.
Exactly.
If you're following along with a certain thing, you want to know how well it's doing, you can get your email in there, and you can get alerts to your email seeing exactly what the legislation is doing.
And may I just point out, I have entered my email to track all 5 of the bills that could possibly address missing Indigenous people, and none of them have been introduced at the committee level.
They're still in subcommittee status.
Well, they have to be introduced in committee to get on the floor, and they'll be dead at the end of February if they're not introduced by that time.
So what's important for people if they really think these are good pieces of legislation? The general public out there, what can they do to kind of affect that change?
Call and email their representatives and the representatives that are on those committees. It's the Public Health Committee, the Public Safety Committee, and the Public Health Committees that have these pieces of legislation. And if they're really interested, they can go to the Capitol and speak with those people. We are all having a lobby day at the Capitol on February 17th. The Cheyenne and Arapaho tribe has a whole half day that the government, the tribal government, is going to the Capitol en masse to lobby for Ida's Law. And I just wish more of our tribes would do that.
And like that presence, what do you think that does for these legislators who are, maybe on the fence about some of these issues? Does it change their minds? Or have we seen these outcomes where they're like, okay, here's a group of people and they really do care about it. Maybe I should, when they see their constituents face to face. But the Red Alert and then Ida's Law isn't the only legislation out there that's aiming to or has the potential to affect missing and murdered Indigenous peoples epidemic in Oklahoma. And I had a question for you. Is anyone else out there in the U.S. doing a Red Alert right now, or is this something that is trending? Is it something that we can adopt and it's been working somewhere else, or could this be an instance where we're at the forefront of leading a charge on something that's really, really affecting Native people?
This would be the very first and only state on the Red Alert. There are other states that do have the missing persons. There's, last time I looked, there were 8 states that have legislation addressing missing and murdered Indigenous people with either a missing person specialist or a task force. But Oklahoma has the highest number of Native Americans in the United States per capita. We have 7% of the population here in Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is the crossroads for human trafficking because of I-40, I-35, and I-44. I mean,
But no one else is really doing a red alert system.
No one else is doing a red alert system.
So this could be the opportunity to really step up and say this is being a powerful tool used for protection of Indigenous people. When we talk about a system specifically designated to help out Indigenous people, I feel like some of the critics might say, oh, that's a lot of trouble just for one group. But
I've heard that already.
Yeah. But this one seems to utilize things that are already in place. It's just a matter, really, of changing the text that pops up on the screen, right? Like, it's not like you're having to implement a whole other, system of communication. It's already being done.
It's already done. And so the cost would be very minimal, if at all. And I think that some of the problem is the perception of treating Indigenous people different and giving them a special status, when in fact it should be looked at as addressing a problem, not about the people, but addressing a critical problem. If it's going to save someone's life, who cares what they look like or what race they are? We're not going to ask for them to whip out a citizenship card in order for a red alert.
Right. Just put the alert out, and
put the alert out.
You don't really, like an amber alert or a silver alert is kind of like they're relying on that family to provide them with the information, and then they're issuing it out through a system designed to specifically help. I had a little part of the red alert legislation pulled up that I thought was really interesting, and it states that where did I find it at? It talks about the national crime reporting status of that alert, and I am trying to find it right now. I might have went down too low.
The national status?
Well, national reporting. It dealt with national reporting. I read it somewhere in here.
Oh, report the individual through the National Crime Information Center.
What line
NCIC. And as I mentioned earlier, where did I just see that? It is on page 5, number 3.
Okay, find out what page I'm on. Page 5, number 3.
The numbers for missing Indigenous people have been underreported because, as I stated previously, no one was putting those into the national database. Currently, there are some people that run their own databases, and that's where we get some of the statistics. But the NCIC is like the Department of Justice.
And I think that that's kind of critical too, because if you see a person taken away from where they're at, it's not general that they're just going to drive down the road 10 miles and stay there. It's usually they're getting out of Dodge and they're going somewhere else with that person, and creating that national, tapping into the national network quickly and can effectively, bring that person home. Can you talk anything, I'm not real familiar with all the components of Amber Alert and what it does, but we see Amber Alerts all the time that someone's from the next state or, in that different region even, but when they believe that they could have a reason, they put these things out. And can you talk about that a little bit, like how that information collection happens when a person, say, I'm going into the sheriff's office and I'm self-identifying as Native American, someone I love is missing, and I believe there was someone who's
dangerous.
Yeah, who's dangerous. Maybe they have connections to Florida. And can you talk about how that process kind of works a little bit?
That would trigger the red alert, and of course, then the law enforcement agency would send that information both to the national data bank to the media, so that it could be distributed. And so that would be like a really major step forward in stopping, again, not only missing people but human trafficking. And the way that the national of course, as you probably are more aware than I am, the way that the national works is that facilitates if they cross state lines, which then it becomes a federal crime.
And it's different classification of crime there. I wanted to take a little bit of a second to pause and let folks know that if you're watching right now and you have some questions that you'd like to ask while we're live with the information, shoot us a question in our YouTube channel chat forum. And you can also comment on Facebook. We're running the links live. And if you have some really important questions you'd like to ask that deal with either Ida's law or the red alert law, hit us up and we can kind of ask questions right now while we have the expert in the chair. Otherwise, we have that additional and supporting legislation that's out there also in the same status. It's not been brought to the floor.
Exactly.
Hasn't, gotten through committee yet, and they are probably pretty crucial components to assisting in, positive outcomes, getting people home, keeping people safe, especially for missing, murdered, and Indigenous people. And I was going to jump over to House Bill 2848 really quick here. And can you talk about this piece of legislation a little bit? And that's the one that deals with training.
Yes, all officers in the state of Oklahoma, in almost every jurisdiction that I know of, has to be what they call CLEAT certified, which is the Council on Law Enforcement Education and Training. Provides annual training to new officers, and then every year they have to go back and be recertified and take so many hours of training. We believed that what was missing from their training was a component about why Native American women and people are vulnerable to being human trafficked. Why is this a problem here in Oklahoma? And so we asked for a bill to be introduced for 1 hour per year, just 1 hour, on missing and murdered Indigenous people and possibly cultural sensitivity. Because the stories that we heard over and over were that the police officer would tell the family, oh, she's off drinking, or she's off drugging, or, don't worry about it, she'll be back. And then
it's almost like the stereotypes perpetuated, and that they just expect, stereotypically, their stereotypical understanding of our culture is kind of feeding into this horrible epidemic that's kind of, it's not kind of affecting.
The stereotype is the reason for
right.
this epidemic, actually.
Yeah, it's kind of the genesis of it all. And this kind of legislation, I've pulled it up on the screen here. It's been amended to reflect problems that come up. Something authored in 2007 isn't necessarily going to affect the best practices today in 2019. But we can see here that, on November 7th that they, added training for a specific item. And then you scroll down through here and you see that 2008, they minimum of 6 hours of training for evidence-based sexual assault and sexual violence training. These kinds of bills get amended and changed to reflect the current needs of society in safety measures, right? And then I'm just going to kind of read off over here, like in 2008, pursuant to authority granted by sections 3311 of this title, they shall include, and it requires courses of study for law enforcement certification, a minimum of 6 hours of evidence-based sexual assault and sexual violence training. So it's something that's ever evolving.
And we could work our 1 hour into that, just fold it right into that same.
So we could be a part of the 6 hours you're already doing. It's just for 1 hour we're going to talk specifically about Native Americans.
But we are getting some pushback from the Sheriff's Association. They want to change the language to they may do it. They want to change it instead of it saying that they shall provide this training of 1 hour to they may. And I said, that's not, because to me, may also means they may not.
And they can elect out of it. So on...
You go ahead. I just said, can you make the text a little bigger, Angel?
Yes.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay. I'm like, I missed my signals.
You're fine. I was trying to figure out what would tell you. The one I came up with was making my hand move.
So I've pulled it up. I'm making it a little bit bigger so folks can read it at home. This is the part specifically that we're asking to change here. It says, effective November 1, 2020, the council shall, pursuant to its authority granted by Section 3311 of this title, include required basic training for law enforcement certification and minimum of 1 hour of education and training to the issue of missing or murdered Indigenous person. This training shall include cultural sensitivity training. So if I'm a law enforcement officer, particularly if I serve as maybe I'm the guy or gal in charge of a department, and I'm serving Oklahomans, which have an incredibly, rich and high number of Native American cultures living in the state, I would think that this might be kind of a no-brainer for me. Just make sure your officers kind of understand what they're walking into when they're out dealing with the public, and we are the public. So is that kind of the premise behind some of this new addition, is that they just be equipped to talk to the folks they're serving?
Well, there are some specific factors that lead to, and you probably are aware, that
Mm-hmm.
lead to the Native American population being susceptible
Mm-hmm.
to being kidnapped, to being human trafficked.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the type things, those risk factors that we want to alert and have. I say alert because I was on the red alert thing in my
Mm-hmm.
brain. But we want the law enforcement agencies and officers to understand that our population is different.
Mm-hmm.
We are susceptible because of certain factors, intergenerational trauma, and socioeconomic factors that the rest of the population isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And they need to understand those factors and know when they are looking for a missing Indigenous person, the background and why it's important.
And I'm kind of trying to envision what that could look like for an officer, and it might be as simple as knowing that just because grandma's come up to report doesn't mean you just ignore her looking for mom to report, because sometimes grandma's in charge, or just different things about our communities that they might need to know. And if, as you said, it's wrapped into training that's already available, what could it hurt to mandate it as it's going to be a part of it? I mean, just for that last hour of your CLE class, it's focused on Native Americans, who are the predominant kind of population in Oklahoma to begin with.
And one of the factors, which shocked me, one of the statistics that shocked me was Tulsa, as like has one of the highest rates of missing women, Indigenous women,
Wow.
in the United States.
In the U.S., that's pretty alarming. I mean, they do kind of sit really accessible to those crossroads, like you said. Of you can get almost anywhere in the country within 6 hours of Tulsa, and that might make it a
You can get out of the country.
Yeah.
Out of the country in one day.
Yeah, out of the U.S. So that's kind of a really critical component to keeping our folks safe. I'm going to jump over to the House Bill 3892, and this one is, I've just kind of labeled it the biological data bill. I'm not as familiar with this one and its processes and what it does for affecting the missing and murdered Indigenous people epidemic. But can you kind of give us some insights into this one that you might understand a little bit better than I do? I'm not a lawmaker on this.
Well, actually, I'm not as familiar with the two bills that were introduced by Representative Bell from Norman, but what I see this is targeting children. And the two bills that she introduced are specifically about children and taking photographs and locating them and putting them into the National Crime Information Center within 72 hours. So that's the critical period whenever a child goes missing. And that's what she's talking about when she's saying requiring law enforcement to gather biographical and contact information. That would help because previously, as I said, Native Americans weren't being reported as they should.
Yeah, so that's saying like this person's a member of an Indigenous community. It might also be as simple as this is what they look like. And so it's just basically setting up those systems that their practices they're already used to doing. You don't report anyone missing and then tell law enforcement, go figure out what they look like. You provide that information.
You do provide that information. However, at the current time, they're not doing it within 72 hours.
Right.
So this is kind of putting an emergency status to that.
And it says within 72 hours of location or discovery of missing or runaway person, the sheriff, police, city marshal, constable, or other local law enforcement agency shall notify Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, and that would trigger that position created if that
Or an Indigenous person.
right.
Correct.
The IDA's law was passed and removed the entry from the National Crime Information Center. That's when they're kind of saying that they're found.
Right.
But in the beginning of that, it triggers them to report them missing there, and then when they're found, you can take them out. It's kind of like
Yeah.
it seems like a no-brainer.
Yes.
That's what you're going to do anyway. It's like you've put in the entry that there's an emergency. Okay, do it this way like you do for everyone else, and then you take it out. So that's not a huge
Just to report
change.
their biographical information.
Yeah.
It's not that big of a leap.
But Maryland Bill also sponsors something that I thought would be really amazing, and it's not even just geared for strictly missing and murdered Indigenous people. It's something that I think would be a huge asset to all people of all races, and that was the Student Photo Database Bill, House Bill 3892. Going to take a little quick look at that.
3893 on the photo.
3893, I'm sorry. Well, let me find my little, I'm getting the right one up here. I might have got lost in my tabs.
And again, parents can opt out of having their child's photo put in this repository. However, just think how quickly their photo could be put out into the media if they're abducted or go missing, if this were put in place. And that is the whole reason behind her sponsoring this legislation, is efficiency and for it to be reported quickly. So
I'm going to pull it up where folks can see it here on our computer screen. People at home can see it, understand what it's saying. If I can get my computer to work right here. I have a little tech issue. There we go. We'll just do it manually. So this one is really geared toward creating a photos repository, and it would be an electronic directory. I'm going to highlight it here. An act relating to missing children directing the State Department of Education to create and maintain an electronic directory photograph repository to store photos of students, allowing parents to choose, so it's their choice to participate in this, requiring that photographs be provided to law enforcement, directing the State Board of Education of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation to create and maintain a list of missing children. So what they're asking, basically, in a nutshell, can you just kind of describe that process, what they're asking to set up?
like a database of photos, basically, of all the children who their parents would like to have their photos on hand at the State Department of Education, and photos are already taken.
So they're talking about going into the schools as like Ruth Kelly or whoever goes in and takes the school photos, taking those photos, having just like some kind of communication between that company that takes them to just the proofs that you would have sent home.
You get the order form. There could be a box right there on the order form.
You
that
can
says,
check mark, put this in the depository. There's a current photo of that child updated like every year, I think. And then law enforcement can get access to that
if they go missing. Yes.
So that is even better for just kind of, I wanted to touch on like a situation, maybe I've had a home fire. Maybe I don't have access to my photos right now. They're in storage somewhere or something like that. But if my child's gone missing, law enforcement can pull up the last picture and it can be sent out in an Amber Alert, red alert. Immediately. And no one's kind of twisting your arm to make you do it, but that's an option. And it almost seems like the adopting this process would be kind of just a matter of communication, really, right? Like between the people who take the pictures the state and the
And
database.
creating somewhere to store a
Mhm.
secure place to store the photos.
Mhm.
And the bill, it, as said, doesn't create anything new. I mean, they're already taking pictures in
Mhm.
schools, and they're already sending them back with a form. The only thing that it would create is the database where it would hold
Mhm.
hold the.
And
Yes.
that goes back to that instance where the earliest you can get the information out, the better the outcomes. And this isn't even specifically designated to Indigenous people. It can be everyone. But again, this is one of those bills that is sitting there just waiting.
Just waiting to be heard,
So-
introduced. And to me, I say that all 5 of these bills together would make a significant impact on all missing people, all of the human trafficking that goes on. And you wouldn't believe Oklahoma, we're probably like 25th or 20. We're ranked up there pretty high on human trafficking.
I just wanted to kind of before we wrap up, jump back to maybe talking about Ida's law a bit. And do you know the backstory on that one? I was kind of listening at the press conference they had at the Capitol with the relative and everything, but I didn't catch all the details, and we might share that with folks real quick on how that came about, being named after Ida.
Well, the representative who introduced it, Mickey Dolan's, his constituent, Lorinda Morgan, is a cousin to Ida Beard.
Mhm.
Ida Beard went missing in 2015. She's still missing. She has not been found. And that's fairly recent, 4 or 5 years ago. And Lorinda approached her representative, Mickey Dolan's, and asked if he would consider introducing legislation to help facilitate the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I'm not sure who actually came up with the idea to have a missing person specialist at the OSBI, but that is something that has been adopted in other states. There's like 6 or 7 other states that have one person identified to assist with the communication between all the law enforcement agencies.
And law enforcement agencies do have a legitimately hard time navigating these different jurisdictional barriers, because Oklahoma, like many states that have Indigenous communities, it's like you said, it's not clear on a map that says, well, that's
tribal land right there.
land.
And
It's all interspersed, and so having that person on the federal level or the OSBI level who can just kind of plug in the gaps of communication could be like the really make or break of a search for somebody. If Light Horse gets a report that someone's gone missing,
and then they can shoot it to that missing person specialist, and they can help get
coordinate the people on the ground. We feel like they might be going to this county, or we're going to rally the search party over here, or keep the alert, people on alert here in this community. That could be a real critical element. Before we wrapped up, I wanted to take a minute to see if we had anybody who asked any pressing questions. Nobody's hitting the questions. Well, I often find out happens with these is people look at them later, and they might be at work right now since we're broadcasting during the daytime. But I did, before I left, wanted to pull up information. You shared with us a little bit about who is sponsoring these bills and where they're at. But if people want to find out how they can contact their representatives and get the information out there, where would you suggest they go? I'm going to pull it up on the website. Is it the OK Government?
It's the Oklahoma State Legislature. All of these bills were introduced in the House, so they would need to go to the House. When you go to the Oklahoma State Legislature, you go to the House, and then there's committees.
Oklahoma House of Representatives pulling it up.
And then committees.
Okay.
And then, as I mentioned, the 3 committees for these bills, public safety, public health.
Committees. And then special committees, House committees.
House committees. So
House committees. And I'm looking for public safety committee here. We're
See,
gonna-
so see how easy it is, and then they have their phone number and their pictures and everything right there.
Yeah.
But I would just really ask everyone to contact their tribal officials. I have a meeting set tomorrow with Chief Hill and Second Chief Del Beaver to talk about how the Creek Nation specifically can help try to support these as a government body. And I would think that all of our tribal governments should be behind this to protect our people 100%. And so far, it's just been kind of quiet. I also have a phone call into Chuck Hoskin Jr., the chief of the Cherokee Nation, to discuss that with him.
Keep us in the loop. We would like to be on the ground if we can rally up. If our folks are going to be at the Capitol, we want to be there to share what they're doing, take some pictures, live stream it, whatever we can, to get the word out and spread the word. So if you have something organized, you want to plug that right now and let folks know when and where to be, or right now is it more of a call the reps and get their attention and tell them you want to see this?
Today and tomorrow, well, until they're introduced, we need calls and emails. Monday, February 17th, as I mentioned earlier, the Cheyenne Arapaho tribe in mass is going to go lobby for Ida's law, and MMIW Indian Capital is sponsoring an event outside on the south side of the Capitol.
Hope the weather is very
I
nice
hope
to
the
them.
weather is nice too, because I'm not looking forward to standing
that's
in rain.
Monday?
This Monday, February 17th, from 10 to 4. And we're also asking people to come lobby, go inside, talk to their representative. We need to educate as many people as possible. The problem right now is that these bills were kind of introduced because of the last minute status. We didn't have enough time to prep ahead of time and get support before.
So there wasn't a big publicity move before they came out. And so now we're needing folks to, if you want these bills supported, we have it pulled up where you can go online. It's pretty simple. I just typed in, Oklahoma State government. We find the House of Representatives. We can even click on these guys' pictures, these guys and gals' pictures. It pulls up their contact information. For example, here I have Ross Ford, who is Majority Caucus Vice Chair. And if I want to email him or call him, it's got his contact information over on this side. It's really simple to get a hold of them. That's their job. They work for us. And so if we want them to do some work for us, we need to give them a call.
Yes, and we are also citizens of the state of Oklahoma, and their job is to protect us. And that's why these bills are so crucial, because it's about not only protecting people that need protecting, it's also about stopping an epidemic, and that's the main thing.
So when we first started, you kind of touched on how this epidemic isn't something that just started in the last year. It's not something that started in the last 2 years. It really does go back a long time. And I really kind of was thinking about this after seeing you speak at the Capitol at that press conference. The first time I ever heard of a missing, murdered Indigenous person, I was in the 3rd grade. And one of my classmates' mothers went missing. And I had to watch this little girl come to school. And she didn't know where her mom was. And then turns out later on her mother was found burned in a car. So that's how big the epidemic is and how much it affects people. Hasn't happened to someone in my family, God forbid. But even I, as a 3rd grader, knew someone who was affected by this problem. And it affects children who have to go through life without their mothers, their fathers, their brothers or sisters. So if you are concerned and you want to reach out, get a hold of these folks, and look to my producers now to find out if we need to address anything else. And that's going to be wrapping it up for this Red Alert Deep Dive. If you want more information, go to the Oklahoma State Legislature website.
Meadow!
Yes, Big Meadows.
Mm-hmm.